Hey folks, Dustin Siggins back with Joshua and Chase. Today we're talking about one of the biggest challenges in public relations, which is finding your storytelling hero, digging deep behind the client's face, their message, their narrative, past the C-suite, to the individuals, to the things that make a story, more than just words on a page or a video that people just gloss right over. The Luke Skywalker, the Han Solo, Sam Gamgee. And as we're going to talk here, there's a lot of different kinds of heroes and ways to represent a hero in the media and in other formats and other mediums to share a client's message. So again, I'm Dustin with Proven Media Solutions, a lot of experience in public affairs and politics, but there's a lot of different kinds of heroes and sometimes enemies. Chase, you're in the content creation gaming space, and Joshua's in healthcare. We're gonna have a really interesting, widely divergent conversation here, and let's go to the gaming guy and content guy next.
Sure. Yeah. So, do you want me to start speaking to the hero narrative, or were you looking for my background? How did you want to kick things off for our viewers?
Sure. Well, more of your background, and then how that ties into how you think through heroes, what they are, how you find them.
Definitely. So yeah, so I'm a 30-year PR veteran. Did 13 years at a PR agency where I was launching video games at the entire 13-year stretch. So I've never been out of the gaming space during that time, and I launched everything from the Sega Dreamcast to BioShock to the last title I was working on was The Last of Us before I also launched Twitch simultaneously and went in-house at Twitch. And then so I launched Twitch and I was there doing their PR from 2011 to 2019. And then from 2019 to a couple months ago, I was at a company called Stream Elements, which creates creator tools for content creators to help them monetize, engage, and produce their shows on YouTube and on Twitch and other platforms. So for me, there's a lot of different heroes depending which era we talk about in my career, but I think since Twitch is probably the most prominent brand I've been at, the way we launched that company was to make the creators the heroes. It was never about, hey, look at us, we're Twitch, what we would do. And when I say we, in those early days, it was pretty much, I was the only one doing PR for the first 6 years. So, but I'm trained in the PR mind, always say we. The approach I took to it was to lead with our creators. For example, when I was pitching story to the LA Times, instead of saying, hey, we've got this cool new platform that people are using to make a living doing what they love, I sort of would reverse that narrative and say, listen, I would tell that story, but through one of the local creators. There's a guy in LA named, goes by the name Gassy Mexican. He was like one of the first big pieces I landed in LA Times on Twitch. And I said, do you want to talk to this gentleman who's making a living doing this? And that's what they did. So they went to his house, they photographed him, they spoke to him about how he's making a living playing video games live. And then through the course of that's when eventually they get to, well, what's enabling this for you to do this? And that's where then they go, well, I'm doing this on a platform called Twitch. And then they start having, well, what's Twitch? And that's when it comes back around to talking to the company to get background. So if you look at the spread, it's a big picture of him in his studio, and then if you read the article, it's all about the human interest angle. And then eventually it comes back around to, and this is all possible due to this platform. And that's really was the whole arc of PR for the company, was just every time we went to a different, regional publication, finding regional heroes. So if it was in New York, we'd find New York heroes. So that's the great thing about being a global platform, is that heroes are everywhere if you know where to look.
Now, Joshua, you talked that in healthcare, there are heroes, but also anti-heroes, and it's harder to find heroes because of regulations and other complications in healthcare, as perhaps a contrast what Chase described about content creators being everywhere and possibly being the face in their local and regional communities.
Yeah, and just to back up, quick introduction. I help pharma, biotech, and life sciences companies create the story of how they're solving healthcare problems. And one of the premier ways of demonstrating how you're solving a problem is to tell a story that features a hero character. I've spent my career working with everybody from Fortune 500 pharma companies to startup biotechs to tell stories that humanize science and make it understandable, and to enable CEOs to become the kinds of storytellers that make their audiences believe in the work and care about the outcomes that they create, because what they're doing is important to patients, it's important to public health. And as a result of the story, the people that are hearing it understand it and feel connected to it. And a hero story is a great way to do that. It's more than just a save the day, feel good type of narrative. It can help create the kind of tension that brings readers and viewers and listeners along into the narrative. It introduces a solution to the audience problem. And that's what communications pros like us really strive to achieve. I love hero stories, but they're not easy. And I don't always recommend them. And to the point that you just sort of introduced me with about the regulatory constraints and all the challenges of creating a hero story, I think that this discussion will serve the folks watching now and that are going to view it later by sort of embracing the fact that it's not as much about promoting do a hero story as it is be the most effective storyteller possible by determining whether or not a hero character is the right protagonist and the right focal point for your story. I recently wrote a three-part article series to help storytellers develop hero narratives, and I dedicated the entire first article to determining whether or not a hero story even makes sense for a particular brand situation. The answer is no, it really doesn't, because not every story can support a hero character. That's why having multiple options and different ways to tell a story is possible. Let me pause there before I delve into the specifics of a hero in healthcare stories.
Well, and I can't imagine a story, an effective story, one that goes beyond, say, a simple op-ed or something similar that doesn't have a hero at the center of it. Or at least someone who is a compelling character to represent the wider situation, unless you're a leading brand, right? If you're a leading brand, you can kind of say what you want and everyone's going to cover it. Elon Musk can run an entire news cycle with a tweet. But at the same time, for the average company, it does seem like you most of the time, I would think all the time, maybe it's because I have my background in politics, that you need to have a face, a hero, either as the face or in the thread that that spokesperson is sharing.
Healthcare is one of, if not the most challenging categories, in my opinion, to create an authentic hero. And it's not as easy to put that face in front of the audience as you might think. Healthcare is obviously an emotionally charged space, right? You could be talking to a stakeholder who is sick, who's grieving, who's confused, who's overwhelmed with work, who's being blamed for poor outcomes. They may distrust the system or the people that are driving that system forward. It could be a combination of any of those. Each of the stakeholders that you're talking to in healthcare also have really different needs. Patients need access, for instance. Providers, doctors, they want simplicity. Payers want data to understand whether or not they should reimburse. Regulators need accuracy and precision. And there's not one single face that can serve all of those purposes all the time. So that makes a hero story in healthcare even more challenging. And then you layer on the fact that in healthcare, much like politics, which I'm sure you can relate to, Dustin, there's an inherent level of mistrust. Healthcare is one of the least trusted industries in the world. So the storyteller, and if that's us as PR people, is under immediate suspicion. And the spokesperson, the CEO of our company, is even under greater scrutiny from the very opening statement of their narrative.
So Chase, one of the things we talked about in our prep call was how finding those heroes who could be attractive, right? In your case, you talked about in the gaming world, in the content creator world, you didn't lead with Twitch. You led with the local creator because that was going to be more attractive. Oh, and by the way, backed by Twitch, on the Twitch platform. Can you talk a little bit, in response to tagging off of what Joshua was describing about different hero in an environment that's very complex and has multiple target audiences, how were you able to deliver a hero narrative and
Well,
find in those
Well,
situations?
there was one word that popped out while he was talking, and he mentioned the word data. And data should drive most things we do in comms, which is
Yep.
that you can also, with streaming, with creators, you can track the data in a lot of different ways. Like there's freeware sites out there, like you can go to a site called Solinome, which shows you how many hours are being viewed of any creator, from day of the week to monthly. And so you can follow the career path simply by following their viewership. And then you can also find out which language they speak on these platforms as well. So there's a lot of data out there that's also really important. And sometimes when you're on the inside track with a company, you can also see how many. There's a lot of different metrics that content creators use out there. There's viewership, there's subscriptions. People are actually paying to watch a creator, but there's also followers. Not everybody who follows pays, but these are all different metrics you can look at to determine the trajectory of a creator, and where they've come from, and how fast they've gotten to where they are. And I think so data is definitely one of the things we leaned into to make sure that we're telling the right story. um
But I'm
Also,
going to challenge.
oh,
Can I
go on.
challenge you on that, Jay? I didn't mean to
Sure.
interrupt. Can I
No.
challenge you on that though? Because
Sure.
I'm a big believer in data. I was a political journalist in DC where there's a lot of data and misuse of data. So I got into politics because I wanted to help the average person
Right.
dive beneath the veneer. But the most compelling narratives, they're certainly driven by data, but they have that human interest touch.
Yeah.
And it seems to me that the hero's narrative, Luke Skywalker isn't the most logical hero in Star Wars. Sam Gamgee is the second level hero who, through supporting, becomes a top tier character, not because of logic, but because of the emotional heft they wear. And so when you talk about being driven by data, that surprises me because of the human interest side of the hero.
Well, no, I mean, I think you have to always figure out what the story you want to tell. We want to tell a success story. And so, there's anecdotal things like people will tweet out like, oh, I was able to buy I was able to put a down payment on my first home thanks to live streaming. So then you're able to sort of look at what have they done, listen to their stories from them directly and go, oh, I can't believe it. This person just did that. Or, sometimes I heard somebody said, some people announce they're going to get married during a Twitch stream on camera, and so you start hearing a lot of these human interest stories, but the data can help support that. And because also sometimes people want to also hear about big success stories, not just the little ones. But yeah, I mean it covers the whole gamut though. Um, but yeah, I mean data alone won't tell a great story, but it will help support it.
I'm really interested in the concept of the people that the audience wants to hear from. And I think about it from my perspective in healthcare, the character that's most often thought of as this character should be the hero, that's usually the wrong choice. And I'll explain, I'll give you an example. Storytellers will default to safety of roles. And in healthcare, the safety of the role of, say, a doctor is not necessarily the right hero for a couple of reasons. Doctors are typically portrayed as the savior, but that's kind of overused. It's a bit of a cliche. It's kind of a trope. It's very predictable, and it doesn't really connect the audience quite as well. And there's a lot of evidence out there that shows that even though the doctors are doing the hands-on life saving, casting them as frontline heroes, such as they were during COVID, was great at the start, but then the narrative shifted. If you remember when the virus started to take over the country and more people were unfortunately passing away, that was compounded by external events like the slow vaccine rollout, proper access to equipment, and all of a sudden the death toll rose, and doctors were not seen as the heroes anymore. They were actually being blamed in a lot of cases. So putting the typical hero into that role is not necessarily always the right choice. The concept of patience, it's the same thing. Patients are positioned as, well, they're the victim, so they're heroic. They're warriors. They're fighting to survive. But if you've ever been a patient with a severe illness, you don't want to be portrayed as infirmed, and you don't want another company kind of dictating that you're going to be that infirmed, weakened person. There's been a lot of companies in the cancer space, for instance, that have taken the perspective of, well, the patient is the courageous warrior, and they've been criticized for the way they've created those heroes. So the character that you might often think should be the hero is not the right one, and that's why I always try to look for the non-traditional hero in healthcare, because those are the ones that have a little bit more flexibility and can be more humanized and believable as you build their character arc in your narrative.
And sometimes I was thinking about that, like, believe it or not, when you're talking about content creators, influencers, especially in live streaming, the funny thing is that there could be actually multiple heroes, because what we always say is that the most important person on a stream is not the person on camera, it's the people in chat. And let me delve a little bit deeper into that. Like, if you're streaming and you have all these people commenting, asking you questions, doing things, and you're ignoring them in chat, depending on what type of streamer you are, like if you're really skilled at a game and people are just there to watch gameplay, that's one thing. But if you're doing what we call IRL streams, where you're just somebody who's just talking or interacting, if you're not engaging people in chat, they will lose interest and they will go somewhere else. And so how you interact with the people who are watching you, they are the actual heroes. If you choose to, like, if you say the show's all about me, I'm not going to pay any attention to you, they will leave. You will not have followers. You will not have subscribers.
It's a great point. Outward-facing perspective. Sorry.
There's also a secondary hero. No, that's all good. There's also a secondary hero, which are the moderators. And so it's like that. Behind every great person is some other great person. That in live streaming, it's the moderators, because if you have a toxic chat, unless that's your brand, but a lot of times
Right.
people who are trying to have advertisers who don't want toxicity on their channel, you have to have a really solid moderation team to make sure none of that content breaks through, because that will become the narrative. Like, I've seen it happen all the time, where somebody with a somewhat toxic audience from YouTube, like, let's say they create goes over to, say, Twitch, or they go from not doing live to going live. And when I was in-house, we're like, if this guy goes over to this channel and starts streaming and he doesn't have a moderation team in place, it's going to go south fast. And sure enough, the stories were, 5 minutes into so-and-so's stream, all this, racist or whatever, harassment, all these different types of toxic content suddenly surface in chat, and that's become all the stories about somebody joining the platform. And so we were always trying to tell big creators who are going to start on Twitch, listen to us, you need to have moderation in place. Sometimes we would assist with it. We'd offer up our moderation team to help them if they were big enough. But a lot of times they think that they could just do it on their own, and they didn't realize that, especially when you have a platform that has, very strict terms of service, how quickly those terms can be disrupted if you don't have moderation. So moderators can often be the heroes as well. So, I mean, that's the thing. It's like, once you've told the hero story of the creator, having other stories to tell of the chat, of the moderation, that just gives you more angles to play with, because you can only tell one story so many times before media want a fresh angle. So yeah, it's like the Avengers. You can have multiple heroes on a team.
One of the reasons I'm enjoying this so much, listening to you kind of explain who can be a hero in your world, and I'm realizing that I still haven't even gotten to who can be the hero in the healthcare world, because there's a long list of who can't be the hero. And there's one more left on the list, actually, that I think it's important to this discussion to raise, because it's a question I get often from clients, and that is, well, why can't the product itself be the hero? We've got medications that do some really cool stuff nowadays. We've got robots that can perform surgery. We've got genetic editing tools. Lives are being saved. Science makes it really hard not to think of the brand or the product or the medical device as the hero, but it isn't. And one of the primary reasons that it can't be is it's not alive. It's not something that is relatable. It's the byproduct of innovation, which is great, but that wasn't born on its own. Its function is static. It performs one function, it catalyzes an end result, but it can't move. It's not fluid. So if the environment around a healthcare brand changes because of politics, policy, the FDA, new data from another company, or new data from a third party institution that's peer reviewed, that can change the dynamic of a product and the claims that it can make in the healthcare environment. If you've put out a story that you then now have to change because the environment and circumstances around your product change, you're no longer, able to work within those boundaries. So all of a sudden, you're trapped because of, kryptonite that's not even of your own cause, and that makes storytelling around the product itself and positioning that as the hero even harder. But there still are heroes in healthcare, and there are characters in the healthcare paradigm that can be heroes. But before I get into that, I want to pause and just kind of give you a chance to react to that.
Well,
I just think it's funny how the dichotomy between dealing with entertainment heroes versus healthcare heroes. It's such a different mindset, because you have so many more regulation and things you have to think about, and but yeah. So Dustin, you were going to weigh in.
So it strikes me, Joshua, and it strikes me that what you're talking about is really communications flexibility. It's looking around corners and seeing what's coming, because we had a campaign a couple of years ago. It was sugar-free gum was the product, and our job was to spread this through earned media by using third-party voices talking about. One piece we did led with, "Do you want to hear how a piece of gum saved my marriage?" No, not really, but when my kids were young, I used to chew on gum so I wouldn't tear their heads off. I tear off the piece of gum instead of their heads. That was the product, was the hero. And this was a slew of op-eds, and the WHO had a study about aspartame, which was is a key part of sugar-free gum. It was misrepresented by a number of media outlets. We got a piece in an op-ed into Stat News framing sugar-free gum as the hero and explaining why, through studies and other things, it really was the hero of your teeth and a hero of your body as part of oral care. So it sounds to me like what you're talking about is, don't over rely on the product, or don't over rely on the patient, but rather have that surround sound marketing and brand with multiple voices, multiple heroes, reaching different target audiences, and being able to look 3, 6, 12 months down the road to see if that narrative should change.
Well, I'm going to push back on that, Dustin, because while I understand your example and I don't disagree with it, I think that sugarless gum is not in a regulated space the way an active pharmaceutical ingredient is.
Sure. Yeah.
So you can probably make the claim with data to support it that sugarless gum reduces incidence of cavities. And I don't have a study in front of me. I'm just sort of spitballing this based on industry knowledge. But you can make that claim. It would be pretty hard to refute. Is it possible? Sure. But the circumstances around that aren't going to change. But if you were, say, to replace sugar-free gum, again, making this up, but let's say nicotine gum. And nicotine gum was linked to an increase in irritability. And those symptoms then led to catalyzing another health issue. Then you've got a changing environment where the product can no longer be the focal point of the narrative. So it becomes a little bit harder in a regulated industry to say that the product is going to be the heroic face of the brand over the long term. Is it impossible? No. But is it the best and most effective storytelling technique? I'm probably going to also say no to that too.
Well, a lot here. Let's talk about what does work, or not what works, but the process by which you find a hero. Because again, we've done a lot of pushback on what can't be, but I do want to make sure that we show everybody how they can work with clients and think through the hero discovery process. So Joshua, let's start with you, because it is such a difficult industry. Let's start with you, and then we'll go from there.
So one of the things that I like to think about is, in the spirit of the discussion about whether or not the product can be the hero, instead of making the product the hero, make it a supporting cast member. And the analogy that I use is Bruce Wayne's butler, Alfred.
Yes.
Alfred always ensured that Bruce Wayne was
Yep.
equipped to be
Yep.
Batman and save the day.
Mhm.
He wasn't necessarily the hero.
Mhm.
Care brand is Alfred. Let it
Yep.
set others to be the hero. So who can that
Mhm.
be? My number one choice is the scientists and the researchers. They're the ones that have genuine human qualities. They're innovative. They're curious.
Right.
They're compassionate. They're the human beings that are behind the discovery, but they can also come out in front and be something relatable. And when I say relatable, I mean the kind of things that I, as a consumer, want to be able to relate to. Scientists are imperfect. They're a little bit enigmatic. Sometimes they're misunderstood. As a consumer, that makes me feel like that hero is relatable. That's somebody like me, and I can get behind that. I can relate to a brand. The company Gilead Sciences, they told that hero story really well when they launched their Hep C brands. They didn't make it all about the product's ability to mitigate the impact of Hep C. They told a story about the virologists and the chemists who worked to end a chronic infectious disease and improve public health. And that specificity was really important to positioning them to be trusted ambassadors for the broader Gilead brand. In addition to the scientists, and these take a little bit more work, but you can take characters that were perceived as villains at one time and use storytelling techniques to change the narrative around them, like payers and insurers. Nobody's more vilified in healthcare than a payer, but you can actually portray them instead of being, greedy villains slashing coverage. They can work to turn data into better access. And we can portray payers as champions of the specific types of data, quality adjusted life years, healthcare economics and outcomes research, make them be the people that are open to listening and adjusting prescribing behaviors in light of scientific evidence. You can make a regulatory agency a hero. You can make industry at large a hero. You can even make government legislators a heroes. They don't have to be the bad guys. They could be the ones that are actually pushing through transparency or affordability bills and reallocating funds towards preventive care. So I think there are a number of different types of heroes, and the setup, which I can go into in a moment, to make them the hero would take shape based upon which one makes the most sense for that particular narrative.
One of the benefits of, say, social media, I don't know the content creator world outside of a generic knowledge of social media. But one of the challenges on social media has been the low barriers to entry and people thinking that they can just shout and be heard, and that makes them influential, powerful. They can be trolls, and corporations will back down, etc. So, what are some of the ways that you had to think through this person is the right hero and this one's not? They may have more followers. This person is more toxic, but the toxic person is more influential or has more followers. How did you think through that process?
Yeah, I mean, and first off, what I always would tell creators is that there's no shortcut to success. You might get the occasional creator who gets a big boost because somebody who is popular brings them on as a guest and that
Sure.
suddenly turns them. But for the most part, people, because there's easy access to streaming tools and knowledge, everybody assumes that oh, just as you can gather that knowledge and have that technology that you can
Hmm.
be a star. And it's just as difficult getting onto a professional sports team as is becoming a professional live streamer. But people think because
Yep.
it's easy to get, I could go
Hmm.
out and throw the football around on at the school nearby. But you know what? But I don't have any mispercep. I don't have any thoughts that I'm going to go pro next week. And the thing is, with content creation, people think differently. Um,
Hmm.
they think that they can do it, and the
Hmm.
challenge is that sometimes there's nobody there to tell them they're not going to find the success that they need. Meaning,
Right.
people will come to me. I've seen people, they've been streaming for 4 or 5 years. They go, I've been doing this for 5 years. I've read every article. I've bought every tool. I know every trick that the biggest streamers use, but I don't know why I'm not getting more followers or viewers. And sometimes, you know what it is? It's that je ne sais quoi. It's that it factor.
Hmm.
I'm not, I don't lack self awareness in the sense that I know if I had all this stuff at my fingertips, I'm not the compelling person who's suddenly going to blow up. Sometimes you have to have that knowledge, because I've watched some of these people and I go, I just don't think they're that exciting to watch. And they might
Right.
look great, they might, or might, but so, I mean, but when we talk about finding the right people, I mean, it's for the reasons you said, like if it's understanding somebody's success level and their perception. Like if they are somebody who has like a lot of toxicity, you don't want to, because the last thing you want is a reporter going to their channel and observing their
Right.
community thing, having this
Yeah.
negative reaction. So yeah, there's a lot of vetting goes into who you want to champion for the news. And
Well,
yeah, but I was going
well,
to say, oh,
oh,
I was
sorry.
going to,
Go,
I was
go.
going to speak because I said, the other half of my career is with promoting games. And I was thinking about a lot of times when a game launches, all the interviews are funneled through the creative director, the person who had the brainchild of the game, and the one who's talking about the plot and everything. But I
Right.
remember when we worked on BioShock, and a lot of games, not just that, but a lot of these games would also have them talk to the music supervisors, the art directors, and you realize that when you hear these other people talk about how they developed their part of the game, it makes the game so much more amazing. Like when you start hearing about what they did on the design side, or what they did with mechanics, what they did with sound, you start to realize, oh, it's not just this one guy with a vision. It's all these
Yes.
other experts around them who collectively, and that's actually how some of these games just seem larger than life when you start talking to all the people who weighed in, who had a hand in it. So yeah.
One of the things that we find really effective is when we prioritize very early in the process asking who should be in the room. It's actually something I picked up from Chris Voss, the author of Never Split the Difference. He's a hostage negotiator, former hostage negotiator, and what he talks about is the need to, when you can't just have one hostage negotiator because you're going to have a bias, you're going to miss something, you're going to misinterpret something. They have a team of
Yeah.
people, but also you're never just negotiating with the person in front of you. The marketing person, for example, my firm, we usually work with the communications team. Okay, but the marketing person has a boss, and they might have someone who's competing for their budget, and they might have a narrative issue that the PR person needs to be aware of. There's so many different components. So what we do early on is say who should be in the room too. And once we can help a client understand that, then we usually the client has all the knowledge. The client is usually the one who can say, connect with this person. So we had that happen earlier this year. I've spoken about this story before. The client said, hey, connect with this person at a state level. The state level people got it immediately. They recommended we talk to a young woman who'd been in a horrific car accident. She almost died. She not only lived, but she lived and thrived. She's going to college. She's going to be a veterinarian. She's back horseback riding, and she had to learn to walk again and talk and colors. She's the hero of the story, but the way we framed it for a Father's Day op-ed at Fox News was her father and God were the two heroes that she looked to. And that was really important for the narrative but that couldn't have happened without the client being willing to have other voices be involved and have that iterative process that allows us to dive really, really deep beyond the frontline people with whom we were speaking.
Something that's interesting that sort of ties in with this in a different level is that I'm some may or may not know, I don't have a job right now. I'm between jobs, but I'm actually getting an offer from one I just interviewed with. Um, so
Great.
and
Congratulations.
but part of that process was I spoke to 4 different C-suite executives, and it was really interesting because when you talk to each one, they all have different narratives for their own brand or different things that they prioritize. And it was so, for me, it was like, oh, this is great. Because sometimes when you go through an interview, everybody asks you the same questions. But when I do interviews, I tend to drive them, meaning when I get on the phone, I give them my background and then I start asking them questions about the company, about their roadmap, about, because I always want to make sure if I'm going to take a job, when you have the luxury to to
Right.
choose where you
Of
work, is
course.
that I want to make sure that there's enough work for me to do and that it's going to be fulfilling work. So by me interviewing for their ex as part of my interview process, you start learning like there's some stuff like one exec didn't mention to me and the other one did. I'm like, that's actually kind of important stuff. Like they didn't have some people hired yet that are going to be important to launch a certain product. Like,
Oh, right.
you don't have a community manager yet. You don't have a social media manager yet, but you're hiring PR. Not that, like these are also important things you need to have in place. But that didn't come out in the first interview that they didn't have those
Right.
roles filled yet. So, I mean, and then, so part of my process is, hey, I know people who can fill these, fill these roles. So, yeah, so that was really interesting to me. So I totally agree about going back to what you said about having more people in the room will let you know where there's opportunities and where there's holes.
Well, something you said early on, Joshua, was that oftentimes a CEO is a less trusted potential spokesperson for a lot of obvious reasons, but also I'm sure ones that are less obvious those outside of your industry. So when I mentioned that young lady, I mean, one thing we do a lot is companies don't want to be the face. They want someone else to be the voice because it's a controversial public affairs or political issue
Yeah.
or policy issue. So, how do you, Joshua, help your clients? The CEO says, "Oh, I want to do the talking," and you say, "No, no, no. There need to be other voices." How do you talk them through that process and guide them to either finding or giving you the pathway to find yourself the right hero?
So there's definitely two different roles within what I'm hearing you say, Dustin. The first role is the spokesperson. And I think
Yep.
that most CEOs will usually embrace being the spokesperson. If they don't, I think the conversation of whether or not they should be the spokesperson is different than whether or not they should be the hero. I'm going to put a pin in should the CEO be the spokesperson just for the sake of time and staying on topic. Um, but the CEO as the hero, that could that could it work potentially? Um, there's so many factors at play that I think about how it's going to be received externally because it's not about us. It's not about the company or the CEO or the PR people. It's about the needs of the audience. Does the audience consist mostly of doctors? Do they need to hear from a business guy who doesn't have an MD after their name? Maybe not. Does the audience consist mostly of investors? Do they need to hear from the business guy with the C-suite title? Yeah, they probably do. So I think there's an advantage to having more than one spokesperson, regardless of the type of story that you have. But in terms of making the CEO, him or herself, the hero of the narrative, the first question I would ask is, do their values align with the majority of the audience? And I think again about what the audience's values are and what they need to hear. The hero needs to embody traits that show an ability to solve the customer's problem. So think about transparency and authenticity. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, yeah, can I touch a little bit? And maybe this is the public affairs side of things, but a lot of times it's a child who's the hero in politics. It is that disabled person who was the activist, and they're kind of used that way. So when you say that they have to have that certain knowledge, how does am I just mistranslating from the public affairs side?
Yeah, I think they're really different scenarios. I mean, a child as a hero in a healthcare story would probably not get off the ground. A, because they can't consent. B, because there's FDA regulations around whether or not a child can articulate messages properly. We never use children as spokespeople in any campaign that I've ever worked on. And I've had clients try to figure out how to do it. And it's usually, a said best left unsaid. It's the juice is not worth the squeeze to have a child deliver your message. Now, I'm not saying that a 17-year-old is the same type of spokesperson as a 7-year-old. And there have been instances where the testimonial of a 17-year-old, which is still classified as a pediatric patient, has been used in print. A comment has been given, authorized by parents and caregivers, vetted with compliance and medical and legal and regulatory. But now you're not telling an authentic hero story. You're giving a key message. And there's a big difference there in healthcare communications.
It's funny. I was just thinking about that, about the kid angle, about how it's flipped for gaming. Like it used to be when you were younger, your parents would say, "Get off, get off the couch and get a job." Now, 17-year-olds are making a living playing games. They're like, "Stay on the couch," because they are like when you have 17-year-olds who are millionaires, because they focused solely on playing games or honing their broadcast craft. It's funny how that the kids can definitely be heroes in the gaming and creator economy space,
Yeah.
because they're showing that, especially in this day and age where there's not a lot of jobs. The job market always seems something that's always pretty tenuous, meaning, you always hear about how hard it is. Like when I was a young kid, I delivered newspapers, but you know who delivers newspapers now? Grown-ups. They drive around in their car and they might have a kid come. Well, I mean, if there's still newspapers in your neighborhood, even when they came to our house to sell them, which is probably hasn't been for about 5 to 10 years, but they used to always send a kid to the door to knock and try and sell you on the subscription. But then it was always some guy would drive around, and deliver it. But my point being is that there weren't a lot of career opportunities. There's not a lot of career opportunities, so that you can do on your own without a boss. And I think that's one of the interesting things about gaming and the creator economy is that you can actually create a occupation, and that's why it's also caught a lot of media interest over the years. Now it's already a given, so it's not a hot topic anymore. But when Twitch launched and those first 5 years, this idea that people can just make a living playing games was like groundbreaking.
And I would think that in an industry like yours, Chase, you could portray a younger person, a teenager, let's say, as a hero, and that would be really well received because it's relatable. Other teenagers are going to relate to a person like them. But in healthcare, there's a risk of the company being seen as exploiting a child by trying to portray them as this person, this young person took our drug. And that's not a reputation that a pharma company would want, whereas a gaming company might happily embrace that. So it's that difference in industry and perception of the end user audience. In healthcare, the audience is so scrutinizing of a company's ethics. And there are some people that won't take a drug from a particular pharma company because of their enrollment criteria in a clinical trial. I've seen it. And it's to their detriment because they might be forsaking life-saving medication, but it's also their ethics at play, and you can't question them. So it makes it more difficult to force a hero patient population if their ethics won't align with the way that company does business.
And the hero, Joshua, about we're doing right now in the healthcare space, and we're using the mother of a patient with a disease as the spokesperson. But the hero we actually have a couple of different heroes at play in the campaign. One is actually the drug company that is providing this sort of miracle drug for kids. But also so is this woman's daughter, where she talks about how the drug helped her daughter do A, B, C. And not that her daughter is driving the story, but the daughter is the hero because you can relate to her and see her as that person who's overcoming adversity. So it's been interesting to kind of get into this healthcare space, Joshua, for the reasons you're talking about, where it's so highly regulated that the drug company would never be able to do this, but a mother can use the child in a narrative fashion where she is the face, she is the spokesperson, but the child is the hero and the company is the hero at the same time because the right spokesperson is the face of the thread.
What you're talking about is a great storytelling technique if you want to get into sort of the nuts and bolts of how the narrative itself comes to life. It's the first person confession approach where you let the character narrate the journey sort of like a removed voiceover narrating a diary. and
Mhm.
gives you the opportunity to use a lot of creative realism in your storytelling. So it doesn't have to be confined to a spokesperson delivering a narrative at a conference. It could be a video with just imagery and a voiceover that you never see. And that's the kind of story that can capture the minds and hearts of an audience that the scenario that you just outlined is obviously trying to capture.
So one of the things we talked about on our prep call, and I think we should wrap up on this side of it, is how to either train a hero or train the spokesperson who's going to bring the hero to the face of the audience. And Chase, you talked about media training early on in our prep call. Media training is an obvious thing for PR professionals,
Yeah.
but I don't think, and we see this all the time on LinkedIn, people talking about my client thinks they're fine, they don't need media training. So, beyond, we certainly should talk about media training a little bit, but what are the other things that a spokesperson needs to be aware of, or the hero themselves needs to be aware of in order to really get that message across? And I think the first thing is to, as we've all said here, focus on the stakeholder. This is not about you. You are merely the funnel for this narrative. And second is making sure that this is the right medium for the spokesperson. Someone who stutters may not want to do audio-based. Someone who's combative may not want to do social media. We have to make sure that people are not only media trained, but that we are positioning them on the right medium with the right people. And so we often talk about it's just not the outlet, but it's the person at the right reporter or producer or host. And is this the best platform for the spokesperson to put that narrative out there?
So I'm not quite sure what the question is, but you make a lot of valid points about how we should be thinking about things.
Well, what else should we be thinking about besides, this media training is obvious for PR professionals. I'm proposing that the right medium and the right reporter or journalist or editor or host should also be considered. What are some other things that we should be discussing that people may not think of when they're talking about training a spokesperson to either represent the hero or bring the hero to the forefront of the conversation?
I mean, we could talk a little bit about the interesting thing, and this is where I talk about PR people as sidekicks to the hero, which is that Robin to their Batman, which is that there's a lot of things that PR people do in this day and age that cannot be outsourced to AI. A lot of times people think they can do it on their own without PR support. There's a lot of things you can attempt to do, but if you want to, I know I'm helping some people out right now, and I do contract work, and I know I can't do it with AI, so I know they couldn't be able to do it with AI. And for example,
Sure.
media training is a great example. You can print out, ask ChatGPT, what are 10 things to do during media training? Like, don't say, look at the camera, wear this outfit, if you're on
Right.
video. But unless you're actually practicing, somebody's asking you questions on the fly and then telling you, not just telling you, how your response sounds, but helping you refine it. And we've all staffed interviews with a spokesperson who there's a succinct way to say something, but they somehow take like 8 paragraphs to say what could have been said in one. And so a lot of that.
My wife says I do that all the time, but that's not just a media issue.
There you go. I do that too, but I do it super fast, so it sounds shorter. But yeah, that's the one thing. So media training, we can't, it's also, the sidekick comes into play a lot of times. Also, like when I staff interviews, I will do on background meetings with the reporters to give them all the background they need to know about the company. So that way, by the time they get on the phone, they don't have to ask any 101 questions to our spokespeople so tell me more about your company. Or if they do, just for their own notes, at least we know they already have a general understanding of what the company does. And then the other thing that being the sidekick is important is when you're staffing an interview, like on a phone call, is to be able to, just because you've gone over all the talking points with spokespeople, I don't think I've ever had an interview where they didn't forget to touch on one point. And so you're able to then interject and say, oh, can you talk a little bit more about this point, and you make, or like, and sometimes you just, you'll just say like, hey, you were telling me something earlier about X, Y, and Z. Can you tell the reporter about that? Even though it's something you talk about.
Sure.
But yeah, so there's a lot of ways that you can help the hero be the best hero they can be.
I think there's a few additional builds for that list, and I'm sure that everybody listening and tuning into this can add to the list even more. But one of the things that I always caution CEOs when going into any storytelling endeavor is they really need to get comfortable with being uncomfortable. And it's not just necessarily a reporter or an investor that asks a scrutinizing question that's going to make them uncomfortable. Sometimes it's the story itself. And what I mean by that is a lot of times a great hero narrative will set up the challenge by revealing the inner messiness of the company's situation. And sometimes a CEO or another leader might be hesitant. And I think one of the things that we as PR folks need to do is going into the creation of the story, know just what the risk tolerance is of our CEO and figure out whether or not it's really worth it to encourage them to have the kind of hero story that's going to need to show all sides of the problem that the hero needs to solve. In healthcare, this is apparent because of, say, the mistrust in the healthcare industry. Sometimes you have to reveal that. There's very often before a success in healthcare, there's a lot of failure. Drug trials fail. Compounds are shown to not have statistically significant efficacy, and those failures cost the company a lot of money. And a lot of times CEOs don't want to reveal just how much R&D went into a drug that didn't make it out of phase 2 clinical. So there's a lot of challenges inherent to telling that kind of story, but the payoff could be great. So we need to gauge with our leadership whether or not they have that tolerance level. Are they comfortable with being that uncomfortable and revealing the messiness and showing the failures before the successes? Because a lot of times a company could come out being portrayed as a hot mess, but that really just makes them more relatable and more authentic in the eyes of their end user.
Yeah, it's interesting because when you talk about health, it's such a different beast than, I mean, there's not that there's not crises, there's crises all the time in every industry, but the sensitivity around, this video game, it's not as good as people thought it was going to be based on the trailer, is a lot different than, a lot of people died because this drug wasn't tested correctly. It's such a worlds apart in terms of the risk certain conversations can take on with spokespeople. But I did want to touch upon, if it's okay with Dustin, talk about how within a company, how to choose the right hero. Is that?
Well, I mean, it's super important because
Yeah.
without that, you can't get to the media training phase. You can't get to the execution
Right.
phase.
And so sometimes there's a misperception that your CEO should always be your spokesperson. But I believe, I always tend to go with what will make the media happy? And often they don't care about the title as much as they care about the information that's being imparted. And we'll talk about, like, yes, if it's a big merger and acquisition, it's a big crisis. It's big investment. There are certain things that, yes, you do want to have your top dog speaking on behalf of the company. But for example, when I worked at Twitch, we'd have a lot of people, competitive gaming known as esports was really popular on the platform. So we'd have a person from an esports publication wanting to ask questions about some of the things Twitch was involved with. And it didn't make sense while the CEO understood esports. We actually had a head of esports on staff. It made sense to have somebody who could actually get in the weeds and talk about all the granular aspects of it than having a CEO could only speak on a high level. And so, but this goes for all different types of departments. So for me, like a new product is released, yes, a CEO could speak to it, but why take their valuable CEO time when you could just have a equally articulate product manager speak to it? And the reporter, they just want, if you say, hey, we have this new widget, they just wanted you to tell them everything they need to know about the widget and be able to field any questions they have about it, tough questions. And sometimes when you get into the product weeds, the PM's going to know more than the C-suite. And so it's understanding who the reporter can benefit the most from. It's not about just throwing your top executive on every op. In fact, I had the opposite happen where I was at a company where they said, hey, from now on, they brought in a new head of comms and said above me and said, from now on, only the COO or the CEO are going to do all interview ops, which is the CEO is fine for but the CEO did not want to do interviews. And the COO was new to the company. So every time I was able to set up an interview, I had to then give them all this background. I had to maybe trade them on the company's background. When there were so many people on staff who I just say, this person's done interviews before this new rule, they can tell the story. And so I missed a lot of valuable opportunities because I couldn't get the two spokespeople. I couldn't get on their calendar with enough time to prep one or enough interest to prep the other. So yeah, so it's I think that's probably the biggest takeaway for PR people is, feel free to push back if on your, the execs are saying this is the only person who should talk to press. I feel, definitely feel as a head of comms or, in PR that you should be pushing back on that. Get the best person for the story. That's really the message.
That's one point where you can extrapolate it exactly the same way into healthcare. And I'm glad we found that common ground between healthcare and gaming, because it's not often that you stumble upon that level of commonality. But I always emphasize the importance of, if it's not going to be a primary spokesperson, at the very least, the scientists, the researchers, the clinical development leaders need to be equipped to be storytellers, because the risk of not having them equipped to be storytellers for a pharma company or a biotech company is really significant. Without them, we lose a lot of ability to connect with the scientific community. It's more difficult to build a relationship with a physician opinion leader if they're not hearing the story from a peer. Scientific media could become less familiar with the organization and more reticent to cover. Presentations at congresses garner less interest if there's not a consistent space. I wrote an article called Storyteller PhD, which was all about teaching communicators to position their researchers and their internal clinicians as primary spokespeople. And I think that's an important point, because if we want to be effective as storytellers, we need to have as many people within the organization able to tell a consistent story to each of their audiences.
And what's also interesting about this whole diversification of spokespeople is that it actually makes, if you have different people speaking to different areas frequently, it actually makes the company look stronger. If it looks like you've got all these thought leaders spread across the board as opposed to just one CEO who does everything, I think it helps with just brand perception. And so, yeah, that's why, I've always doubled down on the right person for the right topic.
I'm not sure if I think you mentioned project managers in the gaming space. I don't know if they get this reputation the same way in healthcare. A lot of non-C-suite leaders get the reputation of, well, they can't be spokespeople because they're just not good at public speaking. And I always say that that's our fault. It's not their fault, because that's not what they do primarily. We need to equip them to make sure that they are engaging storytellers and they're able to tell that dynamic story. And that's a big part of our job and the value that we bring to organizations.
I actually find that most of the product managers I've dealt with, I find, are always very articulate, because they usually have to distill whatever they're working on into a go-to-market plan. So they have to really describe what they're working on, and then they have to pitch it and talk. They have to talk internally about so many people about what they're working on. I find a lot of them can talk really, that I've dealt with, are really good at speaking to the product that they're launching, because they've had to talk it through so many times before that. But yeah, and it doesn't matter whether it's a CEO or an intern, everybody should have media training before they go into an interview. So I'm a big proponent of that. Even somebody who's articulate, when you do a presentation in an office, I've done presentations on products that I've launched, and I could tell, you pull me aside in a conversation, I can tell you the whole case study from start to finish. But put me on camera or put me in a room, suddenly I'm like looking up at my slides, I'm stuttering a little, and you realize that just because you know content, you still have to practice it. And you know, I have notes for probably for this call that I'm glad we talked it through before, because I'd probably not be as articulate right now.
Yeah, it's about, you can be a subject matter expert and be very articulate in talking about your subject, but if you're not connecting with the audience, then all that articulation and all that subject matter expertise is almost for naught if you're talking over the head of your audience instead of aligning your subject matter to their expectations and what they need to take away from the presentation rather than just what you want to say. And that's where I think, just to make sure that my earlier point was clear, it's not that a researcher or a scientist isn't a good speaker. It's, are they prepared to speak in the forum that we're asking them to speak in, which is potentially, to a reporter, not another scientist. They're great with speaking to another scientist, but all the reporters are not necessarily always PhDs as well.
Right. And I have had instances where I've had people do interviews who were experts in their department, but then they end up freestyling and saying stuff that was ultimately like controversial or saying something negative. So it's like you learn early on, like, okay, you've got to make sure that you have guardrails with anybody you're going to put in, even, so, you cannot de-emphasize the importance of media training, especially if it's, somebody who hasn't done interviews before.
So I think we've learned that the real hero is the PR person.
I didn't say it, your words.
Yeah, I want to go back to what you were talking about. I think it was Joshua. You were talking about getting into the nitty gritty and some of the challenges and how that can be risky, both in terms of the C-suite perspective on it. They assume it's risky because it's not just completely sanitized, but also, I mean, genuinely risky in the public eye to give too much detail. And it reminds me, I'm gonna make a little bit of a sidebar here, but bear with me. Peter Kreeft is a Catholic theologian, and he has a whole book on suffering. And what he points out is that for most people, you don't care about Luke Skywalker unless you see him lose his aunt. You see him want to get out of the desert. You see him losing Obi-Wan Kenobi. Only through his suffering and his journey does he become a hero people can relate to. Han Solo being very selfish and then deciding not to. Leia is a strong character, but she loses her planet. It's without that suffering and the seeing some of the behind the scenes, can that person become relatable, and can that hero become relatable? And so, to your point, Joshua, I think there is a need to get past sanitization. Otherwise, it just looks like a press release written for the purpose of being a press release, the purpose of getting GEO and SEO, digital credit, versus actually a user experience that's very positive and makes an impact.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think there's a level of connection that comes from telling a great story that you can't get from a press release, but you can get from a presentation or a one-on-one engagement, or even through an Instagram reel for appropriate brands.
Yeah.
There's a way to connect with audiences that you can't get through every PR tactic, which is why storytelling in and of itself is its own work stream, it's its own tactic, it's its own element of an overall integrated communication strategy.
And then the other thing too is, to your point, Chase, is we call it the 3 T's, which is the right topic at the right time from someone with the right title. And right title usually doesn't have a C before it, or at the beginning of it. And so I think it's really important when we talk with clients is, what do you want to say? When are we saying it? Who is saying it? Then who are the outlets we're targeting? Who are the people at those outlets? Is the spokesperson the right one for those people? And do we have that right narrative for that specific audience? And that's how we have to guide our clients, because so often they either have no idea, or they think the CEO is the right person every single time, or they assume that their news is going to carry through the news cycle no matter what is going on. And the news cycle itself, I mean, so much of it is, I don't want to say random or luck, maybe we'll call it ruck, but we had a client a couple of years ago who wanted to talk about the Israel-Hamas conflict. The first piece we put up for them, it got the 2 op-eds, same outlet, same front page exposure at that outlet. The first one got picked up by Jewish leaders. It got picked up by pro-Israel narratives. It got all of these different coverage. Thousands, tens of thousands of people probably saw it through different platforms. The second piece, I think I got like one republishing. They were published about 10 days apart. And so sometimes even if you have the right hero story, it's not going to land, but at least it's out there. To your point, Joshua, of taking and repurposing through the other tools and tactics of storytelling.
Well, you mentioned the 3 T's, and I would say there's actually a fourth T,
Uh-oh.
which is technique, which is meaning that you have to have the right
Ooh.
story, the right time, and what are your 3 T's?
Topic at the right time from someone with the right title.
And the technique is also making sure that you're seating it under embargo with enough days for them to actually interview the right people, get it out, set it up. And so for me, the technique is actually the thing that people fail on the most, especially people who try to do their own PR who've never done it, because you can't precede something under embargo unless the report has already agreed to accept embargoes from you. So if you're somebody who's never done PR, you can't just write embargo and release and send it off, because that's just not how it works. I don't need to educate your audience on why that doesn't work, but you can't just do that. So understanding how embargoes work is understanding the amount of time you need to lock in depending on the types of news. So for me, technique is also important, because I have so many people, they go, we have great news, we're just going to put it over the wire the day it's announced. Right. And you lose 80% of the coverage for anything you don't precede in advance. And so I would always, that would be my fourth T when you invite me to your meetings. I'll be the guy. Always be closing.
Always be closing. Now, Chase, you were worried how long we would be able to talk for. We've just been over an hour now.
Oh, whoa. And I had one last hero, and this is the biggest hero of them all. It's got hero in the name. The most important thing for any story is a hero image. I cannot tell you, that means a good high-res image that's not just a brand logo. It's something that is visually aesthetic to readers. I'm working with some announcements right now where, it's a bunch of companies coming together, and I'm like, fortunately I was able to but it's not just having a good image, it's having a good high-res image, something that can be repurposed and used because so often, a lot of times people say, wait, you just sent me logos for your announcement. Like, that's not a compelling image, And sometimes then what they end up doing is they have to use found footage. So sometimes they'll take old pictures that you don't support anymore, but it's still, the internet's forever. So have a good hero image, because that's what's going to ultimately sell your story once they've written it. You've got to have that up there.
Well, I'm kind of wrapped up. Joshua, anything else you want to say?
Oh, wow. This has been a great discussion. I am totally going to abscond with the 4 T's that you both just collectively built. But no, this has been a great discussion. I would love to hear the thoughts of the folks that were listening. So please connect with me on LinkedIn. I post daily ideas and tips on storytelling and communication strategy. I write a lot about it on my Substack, joshuamansbach.substack.com. Hope you don't mind the plug. But thank you for bringing us together for this conversation, Dustin.
Cool. Yeah, I also want to chime in. Yeah, I don't have a Substack. All I write is basically
bad advice,
satire to a certain extent. Every once in a while, I'll touch upon something that's human interest, but mostly inhuman interest. But yeah, if you can find me, you can try and find me on LinkedIn in Dustin's posts. But thank you for organizing this, Dustin. Great hearing your perspective, Joshua. I've learned a lot about healthcare. Glad that's not my field I have to worry about. So I'm going to start rounding up children to promote the next video game I'm working on with no fear of consequence.
You just made so many compliance and regulatory people cringe, Chase.
Guys, this was fun. I have to jump, but thank you so much, and thanks everyone for watching. Take care.
All right.